Hey, here we go. We are now on part two of time period number four. Today with this part, we are looking at nationalism and economic development. So here we go. And let's start off with this part right here, public confidence. All right, with the conclusion of the War of 1812, and we see a couple of things that happen. We have politically that era of good feelings, that era of one-party rule, where Federalist power had been waning, right? As we said, they could not prevent the Louisiana Purchase, they could not prevent the embargo, and after they were affiliated with in effect treason with the Hartford Convention, they ceased to have any power outside of New England. And James Monroe wins easily in 1816. And by 1820, remember, the Federalists only got how many electoral votes? Oh, no, one. As we really did have one party rule. However, we have a lot of different factions within that party. And that's going to culminate with the election of 1824, where John Quincy Adams defeats who? Andrew Jackson. Through what means? The corrupt bargain. Because we do see an increase in sectionalism, not like the sectionalism where we talked about the North-South rift over the Civil War, but we see, Eastern economic interests, Western economic interests, and Southern economic interests start to tear the country apart. Not to tear the country apart, that's hyperbole, but to cause sectional acrimony. And remember, not to get ahead of myself, but the whole idea behind creating the Democratic Party, right, is that it was supposed to be a national party. Remember whose brainchild was the Democratic Party? I'll give you a hint. That's right, the Van Buren boys. Martin Van Buren created the Democratic Party to have that cross-sectional appeal, and it's when we had a breakdown in national party politics in 1860 when we had the Civil War, when parties became much more sectional. It is a time period also of tremendous nationalism, cultural nationalism, whether it's art, whether it's education. We start to see a younger generation of Americans take hold, and it's all about limitless optimism, growth, growth, growth. We can go west. We have defeated Europe. We are free of Europe. We're our own country. We're playing by our own rules. There are limitless possibilities as the country is growing. I mean, the population doubles from 1800 to 1825, it doubles. And then from 1825 to 1850, it doubles again, right? And we are continually moving west. So it's like this real paradox between it's easy to take, you can take the easy way out and say it's the era of good feelings, there's one party, but and say this is a time of tremendous patriotism and nationalism. But at the same time, we do start to see some breakdowns in national unity along sectional lines. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about. Let's bang out the easy stuff first, the foreign affairs, okay? Just in case you're wondering who Stephen Decatur is, very minor thing. The Barbary pirates, not pilots, resumed demanding tribute since the Barbary War was a little bit inconclusive. And President Monroe set the fleet under Decatur, and that was the end of that. No more demands of tribute from the Barbary pirates. Remember, we still have some bad feelings with Canada because we invaded them 3 times during the War of 1812. And as war perhaps could have started again, remember, we still have a lot of Anglophobia after the war. The Rush-Bagot Agreement demilitarized the Great Lakes, right, and eventually defortified the Great Lakes. And the Treaty of 1818 solidified U.S.-Canadian relations, where we both have fishing rights off the Grand Banks. I'm not a fisherman, but I know back then fishing was really good off the coast of Newfoundland in a place called the Grand Banks. So we had fishing rights there. We had a joint occupation with Britain of Oregon for 10 years. But the most important thing, and this is unique, and remember, we're real lucky in America because when we signed a treaty with Canada, we accepted the 49th parallel as the boundary between the United States and Canada in the Louisiana Purchase, which is most of our border with Canada, and none of it was fortified. with the longest unfortified border in the world and did not have to worry about a war with Canada. That's kind of important to our development. Florida was not going good. We wanted the panhandle part of Florida real bad. Spain was a mess. Spain was desperately trying to quell revolutions in South America. They did not have much of a presence there. And as our one man with the gigantic forehead in the video told us, it was a nest of pirates, right? You had Indians, runaway slaves, pirates raiding into the United States from Florida. So Andrew Jackson was sent in. Andrew Jackson, of course, superseded his orders and took over all of Panhandle, Florida, executing people, including even executing 2 British citizens who he accused of aiding Seminole Indian raids. But the Monroe administration, ironically at the behest of John Quincy Adams, backed Jackson. We did not have a war. Britain backed down. Spain was in really no position whatsoever, as they were worried about losing their more valuable colonies in Central and South America. So Adams O'Neese, they sold us Florida for the bargain price of $5 million. And all we had to agree was to give up any claims to Texas. That's right. We'll revisit that a little bit later on. That's in the next time period. And then, look, man, take that Stanford woman next year to do European history. That's not my job. But in HWC, you probably learned about the reactionary element in Europe after Napoleon was defeated. And as all these reactionary regimes came into effect, remember like Metternich, the Concert of Europe, that stuff, there was a real fear that these anti-liberal regimes, they crush all liberal movements in concert together in Europe. And it looks like they may try to like prop up Spain and like reestablish conservative monarch empires. And Britain doesn't want that, because Britain is doing great, and they want trade in newly independent Central and South American countries, free of other European monarchies' interference. And we don't want anybody colonizing anything near us in North America. And we decide against issuing a joint statement with Britain, because we realized we got Britain. Like John Bull's got to follow our lead. And we issue the Monroe Doctrine, written by John Quincy Adams, saying that the Western Hemisphere is closed to any European colonization or recolonization efforts. And Britain has to back our play. And well, nobody in Europe is really going to listen to us. They know that the British Navy will make sure that this policy is enforced. And it's, again, a source of American nationalism. So, oh boy, where do we even start? All right, let's walk our way through the market revolution. And I won't go into all of the economic stuff that we talked about in class. To really explain what a market economy is, we'll keep it to a more cursory look at, to make sure we're good for the American exam, the AP exam. All right. So what do we have? We have a country that is an economic mess after the War of 1812, right? I mean, it's a good thing it ended when it did, because we were this close to a total economic collapse. Because remember, in 1811, what did we allow to expire? First National Bank, right? And so we had no standard currency. It was very difficult to finance debt. U.S. Treasury notes had depreciated greatly. And we saw how weak we could be as we had sort of built this ad hoc manufacturing system during the War of 1812. So when we talk about economic nationalism, it's the idea of, hey, if we want to be a strong, independent country, we have to be a strong, independent country economically as well. And this is a wholesale reverse of Jeffersonian politics, right? No more government that governs best, governs least. No more wise and frugal government. It's the government's going to play a role in economic development. The Republicans are out federalizing the Federalists. They're the incarnation of Hamiltonian politics. And its architect is Henry Clay, these new young guys from the West, from the South. Remember John C. Calhoun, the guy that we associate with, I won't even use the euphemism of states' rights, right? But the idea of manipulating the concept of states' rights to defend slavery, right? Early on, he's a huge advocate of nationalism, even supports the first tariff before reversing his course later on. So here we have, all right, what can the government do? The government can do three things, Henry Clay's American system. We can recharter the bank, right? We have the second bank of the United States chartered in 1816. It's the exact same thing as the first national bank. Private institution, but its controllers are appointed, its board is appointed by the federal government. The federal government is the what do you call that? Majority stockholder. It's the deposit. It's a place where the bank of the federal government deposits its money. It issues currency through it, right? Everything's the exact same, and it's chartered for 20 years. That'll be a big part when we talk about Jackson. Remember, the election of 1832 is a referendum on the second bank of the United States. The other thing is, do we have protective tariffs, right? Do we pass tariffs not just for raising revenue, as our tariffs were under Hamilton, but remember, they were less than Hamilton wanted, which is why he had to tax liquor, which is why we had the movement to establish the Republic of Westovania. That's right. So now we are going to have a tariff that's not only bringing in revenue, but is designed to protect American industry. It used to be in the West. We're going to see it move to the Northeast as this time period continues. Excuse me. Oh. And even though some regions, New England at first, some in the South at first, didn't see the direct benefits of a tariff, out of the spirit of economic nationalism, because we realized we were at a severe disadvantage in the War of 1812 because we didn't build up manufacturing, and the Brits just dump everything in the United States. Dumping goods means that you are selling at a lower cost in order to destroy your competitors. So they just kind of flood the market, and supply and demand, right? With the surplus of goods, prices drop. And so the idea was the infant American manufacturing will not survive a British product dump unless we have protective tariffs. So we passed the tariff of 1816, which is in your practice DBQ if you want to do that. Okay. Now the big one though is internal improvements, because we only have one federally funded internal improvement, the not the Erie Canal, the National Road. I've never really heard of it. It's referred to as the Cumberland Road, right? It eventually goes from Maryland and Cumberland all the way out to Illinois. It's a paved road. But the first leg, the leg that was funded exclusively by the federal government, went from Cumberland to, that's right, the Wheeling, West Virginia, which back in the early 19th century deserved a national road being built there. I don't know if you've been to Wheeling recently, but all right. So enough about that. Most of your internal improvements, though, are financed not by the federal government, but by the states, right? And we learned at length about the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, funded by New York. Remember Clinton's ditch, Governor DeWitt Clinton, huge risk, built by hand, right? New work, right? The Irish immigrants, right? Remember, they got all boozed up so that they could relax while working with black powder. Remember the guy put the shovel over his head, right? That was his great safety equipment. And it paid for itself almost immediately, right? And the price of goods drops drastically, and we have the huge canal boom throughout the 1820s and the 1830s as the Great Lakes is now linked to New York City. And this gets to sort of like just a quick review of why the market revolution is a revolution. Remember that from our founding, it was small farms, it was small businesses. And your goal was to be economically self-sufficient. Yes, you engaged in market activity, right? Most people engaged in some market activity, but it's the idea of like, what is my primary focus? My primary focus is to provide for myself. If I work for myself, I control my own labor, right? Like if I'm making, what do I have here? Bank stampers, right? Every time I make one of these stamps and I sell it, who gets the money? I get the money, right? Rather than being proletarianized and working for somebody else. And I have much more control over my own economic fate. With the coming of the market revolution, we see a shift in both production and consumption for the market. right? Like now, all of a sudden, like I am going to produce exclusively for the market, and I'm going to hope that the market is willing to buy what I am selling. Who knows? Somebody from someplace far away may be able to sell something cheaper, flood the market with something. And now all of a sudden I'm hurt, or the victim of some externality where people can't buy my product. And I may be, if I'm not working for myself, if I am proletarianized, meaning I'm working for wages, then I'm dependent on somebody else paying me, right? And I do not get the money for what I make. I rather am paid a wage. And so people become dependent on producing for and having the market produce for them because they are increasingly specialized, whether it is the job that they do or whether it is even the commercialization, the specialization of agriculture. And we talked about, remember, you do that where opportunity cost is the lowest, right? It's really hard to farm in New England, right? So you're not giving up a lot if you decide, well, forget it, we'll just do timber, or we'll just, raise chickens, or we'll raise pigs, right? Something like that. Whereas in areas like in Pennsylvania, it was easy to specialize and just grow wheat, just grow corn, again, producing for that market. But you don't have the market unless you have industries protected from foreign businesses. You have a national bank which establishes a uniform currency and brings stability. Remember, we talked about markets craving stability. And when you stabilize an economy through having a national bank, through having a more centralized national economic policy, it certainly allows trade, the exchange of goods and services, to grow. The big thing that we talked about, remember in class, in 1800, it cost me the same amount to ship something 30 miles over land as it did 3,000 miles by boat. And so that's why canals were so big, as they drastically lowered the cost of production. Roads were more limited. It was city to city. They were a combination. Most of them were toll roads. Some were privately owned. Some were financed by states. The national road was partially funded by the national government. And then we see the coming of railroads in the 1830s and really in the 1840s. Steamboats, yes, Robert Fulton, the Claremont, right, allowed for upstream travel, right? And the bottom line is the market becomes connected, right? The Great Lakes can sell their stuff to New York City, which can ship it over to Great Britain. And from 1815, check that, to 1860, time and distance to ship goods, time and cost of shipping goods drops 95%, right? And that's a really big part. The other thing is work leaves the home, right? That was a massive revolution during this time. Sometimes, when you talk about factories, when you talk about industrializing, right, we're talking about mechanization of production in a building outside the home. But the mechanization is very limited compared to like the Civil War era, where we start to see, the real industrial revolution. But we had things like Eli Whitney, who didn't just invent the cotton gin, but invented interchangeable parts in a rifle factory during the War of 1812. I'm so poor with mechanics, but interchangeable parts means, like, if I'm making a musket, I can take the barrel from one or the hammer from one and put it in the other, right? It's like cheap stamp parts, right? It's like why the Russians survived World War II. Like, their stuff wasn't very good, but they could just keep cranking it out. Where like the Germans had like this super elite stuff, like their Sturmgewehr, and they the original assault rifle. But it was like super complex and so hard to make. Whereas when you have interchangeable parts, right, machine stamp parts, like boom, just stick them together, doesn't matter, you're good to go. You also saw states start to change their corporation laws. Remember, corporations provide you with, you could have said two things: limited liability. I lost my train of thought. Limited liability. Oh, and ease of raising capital, right? Because when you incorporate, you divorce yourself from the liability of the corporation as an individual, right? So if I started a corporation, that corporation went bankrupt, they wouldn't take this palatial estate away from me. You know what I mean? Plus, remember in HWC when you learned about Elizabethan England and the joint stock company, if you're a corporation, like a canal that costs a ton of money, right? Almost said boatload of money, right? Bad pun. A ton of money. Now all of a sudden, if you're an investor and it's $1 million canal and you kick in $10,000 and the canal goes bankrupt, the most that you can lose is that initial $10,000 that you put in. And then you also, tied in with this factory system was Sam Slater, who, committed a capital crime by stealing blueprints out of England. He just memorized them, memorized a textile factory. And remember the early textile factories, textiles were the first mechanized factory system in America on a large scale. And they were in New England because they had to be powered by water, right? The water wheel. And remember though, nobody wanted to go to work in the factory, right? It was a total loss of your economic independence. And this is America, man, right? All I got to do is turn left and go which direction? West. Why? There's a lot of land. Who's not there? Indians. And the land's cheap, right? And so while we don't want to buy into the myth and drink this Kool-Aid that everybody is rags to riches compared to the rest of the world, the possibilities for even like limited social mobility in America outstrip everywhere. And there was a lot of land available to the West. So I could give up my total economic independence and specialize and do the same thing over and over again for a wage in a factory, or I could go try to set out on my own somewhere in the West. So who did the early factories have to hire in the Lowell system? Women. But remember, it was expensive because society, as patriarchal as it was and as unjust as it was towards women, did have this pseudo-chivalric attitude that women could not be exploited for profit maximization. So like they had to be treated decent, right? They had to have these clean dormitories and supervision, and it cut into profits. So by the 1840s, there's a much cheaper demographic to hire, immigrants, right? And all of a sudden now there became a surplus of labor as we see immigration blow up starting in 1845. Not a lot to say about unions, okay? The earliest people that try to organize were all skilled because they were the ones through this structural economic change. Remember, structural change means there's no more demand for your job. And so if I'm like a skilled artisan, like I made candles, right? I'm a candlesmith. I think that's a term. And all of a sudden now I can't compete. There's no way I can compete. I'm making candles here by hand, right? With fine craftsmanship. And it's just me making candles. I sell a candle, I get the money. This is awesome. I work in my house. I'm economically secure. But as candles start to become more mass produced outside, or something is produced with mechanization, like weavers, right? Or cobblers, as shoes and cloth, textiles, are mass produced in the factory system. All of a sudden, these guys got to go join the factory, right? Where now all of a sudden they go from working from the shelves and totally controlling production to having the most minuscule control of their own economic life. They try to unionize, but they have almost no success. Most states outlawed it, but more importantly, there was just a surplus of labor and their skills weren't as needed. And as we talk about the expansion of slavery, again, you don't have that without the cotton gin, because the cotton gin separated seeds from the cotton. It allowed short staple cotton to become profitable, and short staple cotton with all of its seeds in it could be grown pretty much anywhere in the American South, as opposed to the other type of cotton, long staple cotton, which could only be grown on the Atlantic coast, in some places in South Carolina, the Sea Islands of Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to, again, we can expand. We can grow grain in the heartland, cotton in the South. But, right, as we talk about that, I'm going to skip the courts for a second, okay? We have an issue here over slavery. So, like, look, you ask your, we've already talked about, look, your average American is going to be able to see through the charade of how does slavery exist in a society, a country that was founded on the idea of liberty, right? And your average American is going to think slavery is going to die out, right? You've got the constitutional ban on importing slaves from outside the United States taking effect in 1808. Tobacco exhausts the soil. Eventually, you're going to run out of land. And the future of slavery appeared to be not that certain in even in the South, until you started to see the cotton gin, and all of a sudden now, whoa, this is something that can be profitable. And that's where you start to see the shift. I don't want to get ahead of myself, from slavery as being a necessary evil to the apologist argument, the peculiar institution argument, like slavery can be a positive good. Who said that? John C. Calhoun. Okay. So let's get to Missouri, right? This is a big deal because it's the first state from the Louisiana Purchase to apply for statehood. And Congress had carefully kept that balance of 11-11 as far as free states and slave states. And while there's no abolitionist movement to speak of, right, we start to see the South emerge with a different type of economy from the West, from the Northeast. And well, what do we do about currency? Do we have cheap currency readily available? Do we have? Do I have the Panic of 1819 in here? Well, there it is. All right. Well, I will. Okay, because remember, you had, with the Panic of 1819, there was a huge speculative boom in land, because Europe had a hard time recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. There was a great market for American foodstuffs, and rapid expansion westward as unregulated state banks loaned money. They were loaning money they didn't even have. And then the bubble burst in 1819 when the Second Bank of the United States was like, inflation's out of control. Speculation's out of control. We're going to have to take a short-term hardship to prevent a long-term economic disaster. And they rapidly tightened credit. State banks failed. Loans are called in. People go to debtor's prison. You see people in the West have land foreclosed upon. Unemployment skyrockets, and it takes like a solid 5 years to sort of recover from that panic. And people blamed the bank, particularly Westerners. And so look, I went off on that tangent to just show, like, hey, while we have all of this great stuff going on over here, all of a sudden now we start to see some sectional interests emerge. And now, well, okay, are we going to continue to expand and give the South more political power vis-a-vis slavery, or are we going to put limits on it? And the South is on the defensive because they're already the minority in the House of Representatives, and it's going to stay that way. And so when Missouri applies for statehood and slavery is really well established there, we have the first shot fired. Representative Talmadge from New York puts on an amendment, right, that says no more slaves brought into Missouri. All slaves in Missouri are freed after their 25th birthday. It's a de facto repeal of slavery. The South goes nuts. Remember, this is the first time there was a national debate over slavery. Everything kind of disappeared during the Constitution because the idea was there's such a crisis in the country in 1787. We'll make concessions that are necessary out of the spirit of nationalism. There was also that perception, as I mentioned to you before, how much longer can slavery exist? Now, all of a sudden, you have a congressional Donnybrook about, do we allow in the Louisiana Purchase, this huge tract of land, remember, it doubled the size of the United States. Are we going to allow slavery to expand there? And this representative from New York said no. The South said, my God, this is an assault on slavery. If we bend here, then all of a sudden what's going to happen? Like, we one of two arguments. The worst one is, next thing you know, slavery is going to be attacked in states where it already exists. The less radical argument is slavery is going to die. If it doesn't expand, it's going to die, because you're not going to have that de facto veto in the Senate with an 11-11 vote. So the South digs in, and they won't accept it, and they won't accept Maine coming in as a free state, which was still owned by Massachusetts then. And so after a year of crisis, right, where what are we going to do about this? Neither side seemed to want to bend. Henry Clay comes up with the compromise of quid pro quo, Missouri admitted as a slave state with no restrictions on slavery, as its constitution permitted. Maine comes in as a slave state, and then the famous Thomas Proviso, right? I guess I should just add this here. No disrespect to you, AMSCO, right? The Thomas Proviso, which says, okay, we're going to draw a line, right? 3630, line of latitude, and say all of the territory north of that in the Louisiana Purchase is closed to slavery. South of that, there will be no restrictions from the federal government on slavery. So the crisis was averted. However, as you're going to see in your practice DBQ, who was really nervous about that? Thomas Jefferson. He called this a fire bell in the night. And I'm going to leave that to your practice DBQ. We certainly talked about that at great length, right? How now all of a sudden, even though it lasts, I guess you could argue until 1850 with the Compromise of 1850, it's the first national debate on slavery, and certainly all future debates over slavery, which are going to intensify with the coming of Manifest Destiny, as we pick up half of Mexico in the 1840s. That idea, we settled it in Missouri, or excuse me, in the Louisiana Purchase, but what are we going to do when we acquire all that new territory? The one thing I didn't get to, all right, this stuff. The Marshall Court. Marshall is the last Federalist that matters. He's a Federalist, and even though by the time we get to the Market Revolution, most of the Supreme Court, the majority of the Supreme Court were appointed by Republicans, Marshall's a straw that stirs the drink. He makes the show go. He persuades the court to interpret the Constitution in a way where the federal government is going to be supreme over states, right? And we see a couple of cases that assert the dominance of the federal government, as well as fostering an environment that is good for national economic growth. So you've got your cases here. You have Fletcher v. Peck in 1810. If I got in the weeds with this, you'd punch your computer. Look, what was it? In the Yazoo Land Company in Georgia, right? There was fraud. The Georgia legislature said, oh, wow, there was fraud in this land sale that in the 1790s, the Georgia legislature had approved. We are going to undo that contract. Right? There was a case of fraud. There was an act of legislature to sell land. There was fraud that was associated with that by a private entity. We are going to pass a new law, a new legislative act that undoes a previous contract we made. And John Marshall, they give him the Dikembe, and they say, no, the federal government, it says clearly here in the Constitution with the contract clause, that this is the responsibility of the federal government and that states cannot invalidate contracts. And the court here has established the principle of judicial review, which it first brought up in Marbury v. Madison, to extend to the act of a state legislature. A state legislature tries to invalidate a contract. No, contracts are protected by the Constitution. A state cannot undo a contract, and the precedent is set that not only are contracts free of state legislature interference, but acts of the state legislature are subject to judicial review as well, right? And the case of, Cohen's versus Virginia, right? Where in 21, where even though the Virginia law that had arrested the Cohen brothers for selling lottery tickets out of Washington, D.C. into Virginia, the Supreme Court agreed with Virginia's decision, but said we still have the right to review it. The federal government has the right to review state criminal statutes. Now, a couple of other big dogs here. McCulloch v. Maryland. The state of Maryland tried to tax the Second Bank of the United States, right? And the Supreme Court in this case said that you cannot tax. The power to tax is the power to destroy, and this is a federal institution, a constitutional institution. This is part of the all necessary and proper, and the states cannot invalidate a federal law, which they were trying to do through taxation. So it upheld the constitutionality of the Second National Bank. Dartmouth College, right, was an old Federalist institution, and the new Republican legislature tried to invalidate its original charter because it was a private school, and it tried to make it a state school. And the Supreme Court said no. Just like in Fletcher v. Peck, a state legislature cannot invalidate a contract. In Dartmouth versus Woodward, which was in 1819, the state legislature cannot invalidate a corporate charter. So as we talked about with long-term effects, remember those sample short answer DBQs I wrote you, all of this stuff, right? So now in Fletcher v. Peck, wow, this is great. I don't have to worry about a contract being undone by state legislature. Promotes economic growth, creates a sense of economic stability. Markets crave stability. McCulloch v. Maryland, the Second National Bank is going to be around. I'm going to have faith in currency. I'm going to have faith in our banking system. Corporate charters cannot be undone just because you fall out of political favor. Gibbons v. Ogden, right? The state of New York was granting licenses to steamships operating on the Hudson River, and the court ruled, no. If it's involved in interstate commerce, states don't regulate that, the federal government does. So it allowed for a greater sense of uniformity with interstate commerce. A lot of this coming from the implied powers. Again, the Federalist John Marshall taking a very broad view of the powers of the federal government by the Constitution. Okay, that's it. I'll see you on part 3. Oh, God.